Welcome everybody back to the J3U podcast. I am your host, John Jewett, and with me is Luke Miller, co-host. How's it going, Luke?
Good, man. Ready to rock today. Fun topic.
Right on. It's just us today, no guests, and I am when you're listening to this, I'll probably be 3 or 4 days out from the Indy Pro, which has been a very exciting prep. And with that on mind, I want to discuss conversations of peak week and what goes into it. I've put up some questions that on IG of what people wanted to hear, which is a lot of the usual stuff like how do you manipulate water, sodium, electrolytes, do you all the supplements or diuretics and everything. So there's a lot to be discussed. There's a lot to not be discussed as well. And kind of what I mean by that is peak week has been filled with leprechauns, unicorns, and pots of gold. And it's been, stouted as being like the week that's going to save you when you're not ready, or it's going to transform your physique. And I've seen a lot of protocols just kind of marketed and sold as like hyped as being a different coaching experience and draw people in that way. But we want to discuss kind of the realities of peak week and get into that conversation today and try to bring some transparency and some realism so y'all can kind of disseminate through what is actually should be happening during and before peak week and what should not be happening.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that starts with like the prep process beforehand, right? There's a lot that can kind of tell you coming into peak week, and I think that's probably the most important thing when it comes to running a peak week at like the best way, because there are a lot of variables to manage, right? You've got like fatigue, water, sodium, food, etc. You can go down that rabbit hole all day. But if you haven't been doing that throughout the entire prep process, you aren't going to be coming into peak week informationally with the data and the things that you need in order to make the decision making during peak week be as minimal as possible. And I think that having the mindset of going to be to make it as minimal as possible is probably not one that's overly perpetuated within our industry a lot, but I think it needs to be, because the best looks typically come without these fire in the hole methods, right? Like these things that are so far away from what may have made you look your best during your peak week process, right? Like how many times have you heard people like, man, I wish I could have walked on stage the way I looked 10 days out or 14 days out or things like that, right? If you see that kind of look during the prep process, that probably should clue you into the fact that you're doing something right during that, and you need to understand the variables that have gone into that look 10, 14 days out, rather than trying to recreate it through some magic protocol.
Yeah, it's or even it's like the day after the show, right? You look phenomenal. I've had a few of those moments. A lot of times it's has even been between like prejudging and finals where I'm like, oh man, looks amazing, and wow, just totally missed the mark. And then you try to do something else to maintain that look or even hold it. This happened to me at the 2018 Dallas Europa. It was a pretty good showing. Like I looked pretty good in prejudging, but it's a 2-day show. And so you have to like, oh, you're going to rehydrate, add more fluids in. I had plenty of food, but from after prejudging, we were going to go do this like barbell club event for animal. And so I just kept drinking water. I remember I was having 16 ounces of water between meals, and my body weight came up to like 217 when I was around 212 on stage. And I trained just like a upper body kind of like push session and looked just mind blowing full hard. Like it was like, oh my gosh, I'm about to rip out of my skin, that kind of look. I'm like, what did I do? And you think back through all the variables, like how do you recreate this? And honestly, it's like, well, you cut water, you moron. And then what'd you do? Oh, you added water back in. Be basic of how you store like carbohydrates and get fullness.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it happens even at the highest level pros. Like we're doing crazy stuff that just doesn't, you can't control it. It's so hard. Even then, like you eat a meal and people act like they have it dialed down to like this science, and it's not. It's like, because you eat a meal and that meal is going to be digesting for the next 5 to 7 hours, typically, depending on what it is, could be less.
Right.
And are you able to predict what's going to happen in that time period? You probably have another meal that's overlapping in that period, but you have people like eat this meal, then like 90 minutes later, you're going to send me pics. And you're like, okay, that's how it looks. We're going to change this now. And it's like, man, you can't control it that well. And even the alterations that are happening in aldosterone, antidiuretic hormone, they're rather rapid. And so some of the stuff just is not that controllable. But before, yeah, I think setting the stage, it really comes to going into peak week, where your look is at. And so what peak week is not is what we always already discussed. It's not the time where we are going to take someone that still has body fat on them and get the fat off. It's just you're only have so many days left in that process. So the idea of going into peak week is you need to be skinned lean. You need to be truly stage lean. And what does that look like? Well, it should be like, I remember, and I think it was a podcast, Shelby Starnes said, like, pinch the back of your hand. He's like, your whole body should feel like that. And, your back of your hand is about a 3 to 4 millimeter skin fold. 3 to 4 millimeter skin fold around your whole body is skinned out lean. Like, I'm very lean right now, and I don't even have that. Like, my glutes will get down to like a 5 millimeter, and that's when I have like lines from my ass crack out. My subscap is like always like an 8. I guess I'm just a thick skinned back guy. But that's about the leanest I've ever got. My fattiest skin fold sites. Front shots, yeah, like they could be like 3 to 5. But I like using calipers just to gauge where I'm at in some spots. But of course, we're just going to visually look at pictures as well. But you should basically look like you could walk on stage and have that look. And I think where the mistake is made is when you look at someone and I've heard it and it's been told to me, like, oh, that's just water. Don't worry, that last week you'll pull that. I think that's the assumption and the thing that's given out to people just to make everyone feel better, or and that's going to take you down like a path of not pushing and to get that rest of that body fat off. I think there's also some like psychological limits to people as far as like they're seeing their body weight hit lows that they didn't expect to be hitting, and they hold back for that part of the reason. Like, oh, I don't want to get small on stage.
Yeah.
But it's really time just like to keep pushing that fat loss. And honestly, like, I would still like I tell people, even if it's their first show, like, have a few shows picked out. For one, if you're lean, you should maybe do a second show. But also, if you need more time, take more time. That extra week or two can make a huge difference in getting that last bit of fat off. And then you can really present the look that you want. It's okay to have more of an open-ended prep, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that from a psychological standpoint will relieve some stress for people, for like, in case shit does hit the ceiling fan, right? Like, I'm prepping someone who ran into like some like clinical GI issues, right? And it's like, that's going to set back our timeline a bit. But she came into this prep saying like, hey, like, I've got like 5 shows picked out. Like, this is kind of where we're at. We're a little ahead of schedule. So this is okay that this is happening, right? And it's one of those things where like she's responding to managing these GI issues better than the majority of people would, because she doesn't have the stress of like, oh shit, I'm not going to make my show now or whatever. Like, cause she's still on track to make it to one of those 4 to 5 shows she has picked out. Right. And so from a response side, like, that's an important thing as a coach to like manage that stress reaction for the response. But John, I think one of the questions that comes up, like kind of coming into peak week, is like, how far out are you using data in order to inform your peak week? Because like the physique that's 14, 15 weeks out is not going to respond the same to variables to the physique that's like obviously in that peak week stage. So one of the questions I get when it comes to gauging response to these variables, like in order to give information for peak week, is like, how far out are you taking that information for the individual to help guide that peak week process before we actually get into that peak week process?
Yeah, you have to, of course, be relatively close to stage leanness.
Yeah.
Because you don't know where you're going to have to necessarily take someone to get that little extra bit off. But a lot of times that little extra bit will come as, it's almost when you can increase food a little bit, and if you have someone that's uh, metabolically adaptive, increasing food, they tend to speed up in a sense, and it can be a positive. But you could wind up even 3 weeks out from a show with a diet plan that is pretty different the week of the show. But we can have some general gauges to utilize. So I think once you're within that probably 4 week out ish mark, it starts being a better tool for what we're looking for. And the tool is what we're trying to monitor is what type of manipulation can you really do to nail the best look on stage. And then, when is that person waking up and their weight and everything at that look. And so that's why I think you can't just we have had some research come out on diet breaks and refeeds, and they might not have the impact on muscle retention or slowing metabolic rate that we thought. But the studies also don't get into the fact that, hey, this is some practice data for us for peak week to gauge how many carbs someone might need to get a full look if they've been flat and dieting.
Yep.
And by far, carbohydrates is the greatest thing that we have to change the physique. Um, and probably the least risky. And I don't mention like, water and sodium, like these things need to be in place. But what you do at that 3 to 4 week out mark is when you have someone that's having a high day. That's when we start monitoring on that actual day. Well, for one, what do they look like when they are flat? And that's an important tool to know. And then, well, if we're giving them a high day because for whichever reason maybe training performance is dropping off, we need to relieve fatigue. We need to give them the psychological break to be able to keep pushing. On that high day, we can monitor how is digestion for you this day. Like, are the food sources that we're picking not causing bloating or gas? Are we seeing them move into a state of fullness and a harder look? And then by that next day, when they wake up in the morning, how has body weight changed? How has their look changed? So I think this scale is really helpful too, just as a tool. When you're just looking at someone visually, sometimes it can be hard to see things. Sometimes you might see it, but then you'll hard to disseminate it because they could go soft and the scale weight might go less or more. It's like, well, are they flat? Or are they spilled? Or what's going on? So I think it's a helpful thing. I think it was Matt Jansen that had kind of brought this up. But I mean, we see it as coaches is like, if the scale goes down and you look soft, that usually means you're flat. The muscle's not pushing against the skin as much. If the scale goes up and you look soft, then you probably had too much carbohydrate and spilled over some. If the scale goes up and you look hard, awesome. You're probably full at the right level, and that's probably a good carbohydrate and fluid amount that you should have. And now it might not be the next day right after the high day they look their best. Maybe they did get a little bit watery, and then going back to their base plan, they meet that happy medium. The 2 days after, they wake up and like, oh, that's the look. They look full hard, and maybe that's down a pound. And so you're like, okay, at this body weight, you have that note. They look their best right now. We had this many carbohydrates. Then they went on their base diet, and that's when they cleaned up. So now you can have like in back of your mind, okay, going into peak week, maybe that's carving them up on a Thursday. Friday they go on their base plan, and then they have their show day. Considerations though is that, hey, you're one day out. It looks a whole lot different than your 3 weeks out. What you're doing for that day, right? Because we typically taper a lot of things down, and so people usually sitting around on the one day out. They're not training. They're not going to probably do as much cardio. So that same carb amount might be a bigger impact than it was previously. And so that's why you're going to still have to. It's a template you're going off of. Gives you an idea, but you'll still have to monitor them on those days. But I think that's when we're starting to build a base around it, and around what carbohydrates and how that changes the look. And I think that will be the main manipulation you should make. And if you're a beginner, that's what you need to learn, to just learn carbohydrates, and don't even worry about water and sodium. Keep those variables constant relatively to the carb amounts. But once you learn that and can nail that look, that's pretty much how you want to be walking out on stage, right?
Yeah. And something to kind of note too is like with that carbohydrate influx is like maybe starting to understand the fluid intake on the day to day as well at that point. Like having them just track like a general consensus of what the water intake looks like with that carbohydrate amount. And then using that to like you said, gauge where you start the carb up. Because like, for example, with Emily, she's not close enough where it's like telling me exactly for peak week, but this last little refeed bumped her up. She responded with a drop immediately and then continued to drop. So like it was high food, half a pound drop, 2 pound drop. And today was the best look of those 3 days. And so there's some things on the fatigue side that we understand probably helped, but understanding what the response looks like, cause she's getting to that point now where she's responding better to influxes of food, where in the past it's been like refeed, pound up, 2 days later it's back down again, right? And so you can start to see that change, and having that tracked is important, because if I just go off what happened at 14 weeks out when we did one instead of this point, then it's not going to tell me what needs to happen moving forward. So it's just good to have the data, but it's probably more applicable, like you said, in that 3 to 4 week out where the body comp's fairly close to what you're going to be on stage.
Yeah, that's another point in itself, like you brought up, is like we like farther from the show and you're accumulating more fatigue, you might see those bigger drops just from the watershed of dropping off fatigue. You might not have that on peak week, but you might. I've even personally like woken up at body weight lows on show day, and you're
Yeah.
like, whoa, like, and it's just because, well, the day before, like, yes, I am not moving as much, but also it was such like a relaxing state to be in, and not doing all my steps and cardio, that I end up dropping off so much fatigue in that, and I have a substantial water drop. But you have to just gauge, like, is that look better or not?
Yeah.
And it'd probably be different for a lot of people, but I think ideally we want to set up that look of low fatigue before peak week even happens, and not having like to race into the show, uh,
Yeah, for sure.
with it. But I think even then, like, with you are trying to still monitor like water and sodium. I try, like, I mean, ideally it's nice to do what I do and be able to train when I like, because I can try to emulate show day a little bit more, and
Yeah.
like train around, hey, this is after 2 meals, which is typically what I would do for a show. And so I can look at like body weight after I train, the look after I train, just like if I was to pump up, and be
Yeah.
like, all right, this is pretty close. Some people don't have that, and they're like, they're working, 8 hours a day, then they have to go train in the afternoon, then they're driving home, and then they're home and everyone's yelling at them, and it's like, a lot of stress and fatigue that's built up. It's like, how do you emulate that for peak weeks? Like, oh, you really can't. You just do the best that you can. So
Yep, for sure. And I think that before and after picture is important too. Well, not before, after that, morning post workout picture things too. Like that's something I start to institute the closer we get, is like more information on what does a weight change / fluid change look like from first thing in the morning to during the day. Because you're not waking up and going on stage. You're waking up and having
mm,
food and going on stage, right? And so we need that look to compare to the morning look, where it's like, okay, there is a differential here. What is that differential?
have you had anyone that when they wake up first thing, that actually is their best look, and like adding food and water in actually makes it worse, no matter like what? Like, have you had a client like that?
Yeah, I've most of the time it's like that morning looks like slightly flat, and you just give them just a bit and it's better. But I've had like 1 or 2 cases where it's like you wake up, it's like, fuck, I just wish I could just put you on stage right now. That's like, who this happened with was Ming at
Mm.
Indy Pro. He woke up, I was like, fuck, we've got like 6 hours till you get on stage. And it's like, you look so much. And every morning it was the same thing. It was like the 6 days leading into the show, it was like the morning look was better than that 2 meal, because he competed at like 10:30. And so he'd be like about 2 meals in. It's like 2 meals in was not as good as like first thing upon waking. And so my approach there is like have that person ready beforehand, where that minimalist approach on show day can just be like just enough to keep them ticking.
I've had some people wake up like that, and then I've seen them the days prior, and I kind of realized like, man, they just get like this softer look. And it's like I've had, and it's sometimes it's females just because they don't need as much. And I
Yeah.
think as I'm tapering down, they're starting to like maybe get spilled a little bit, and then overnight they end up kind of like having that water drop and they look tight again. I've had people where like they wake up and I've had them like not eat before going on stage at all, or drink anything. Just that day, it's like you look good. Just we won't even have anything because I know where the look goes. And that's
Yeah.
not always the case, because sometimes, like we had mentioned, like with the carb up process, is that you don't quite nail it because the day prior they didn't move as much, and so they actually do spill a little bit, and maybe you see that weight came up more. Well, you can just have them fast for a while and then do some pump up work, expend some glycogen, and a lot of times they'll tighten back up, and that's what you need to do. It's not the time like, oh my gosh, add in a diuretic because that's so hard to time. A lot of times we wake up and hey, you're a little watery. Let's like go through some posing, some pump up. Let's hold off on eating and fluids for right now. Then they like you'll see them start coming back, and that could be enough to do it. Or I've had lots of girls like even the day before the show, we just go back to like protein fats because
Yeah.
the carbs the 2 days out was plenty and they look full, you know. And if you get someone full, like you can hold like a glycogen load for several days after it's present.
Yeah. And I think that's important too, is like understanding that food manipulation for hold. Like we don't have to constantly feed someone carbohydrates, right? Like we just need to keep them ticking, right? And it
Yeah.
and it could be the opposite. Like I have one guy I'm prepping right now who it's like his fasted look almost like tells me the timeline is different compared to like 3 meals in. And it's like he's like 7.5 weeks out right now, and I'm already having his check-ins be like morning and midday or morning and afternoon picks. Because it's like food and water, he's like, okay, you're 3 weeks out. And then in the morning, it's like, ooh, this is not a good situation. It's like a drastic difference. And it's just like that flatness, right? He's like 7 weeks out eating like 380 grams of carbs a day.
Yeah.
So
That's it's interesting because like um with that like the picks midday or even post gym, like people could look leaner in a different lighting too. So you have to like kind of tease that out.
you try to
Um,
keep the lighting as consistent as possible.
yeah, yeah, because like everyone's like, "Oh, John, if you saw me in the gym, man, like I look so much better than my morning pics." I was like, "Yeah, don't we fucking all like it's we have like lighting from the heavens shining down to highlight all the details, and you hear like food in, pumped up, like veins out. Like, well, hell yeah, most of us look better. Take a picture, like this is what I really look like, coach. Like, do you want me to prep you off these pics, or when you look at your worst?" But
Yeah.
comparative wise, like for what we need as coaches, consistency is key in the look.
Yeah.
So having like the consistent lighting and place of those pictures is pretty ideal
Yeah, for sure.
for
Important
comparisons.
because like maybe having that person like he comes home and takes those post workout pictures
Okay.
so that it's consistent in the sometimes he takes them at the gym, but like I've been following his gym pictures along the same pace too because I started this like 15 weeks out just because I was already starting to see like morning to afternoon differences, and most of the time he takes them at home, but like sometimes it's at the gym. It's pretty easy to track, but like yeah, that down lighting in front of the mirror that Jim's put so that you just
Yeah.
look absolutely insane, and it's
But
like
you know it like as a coach, like
yeah,
we
you
know
see
like the
all the
lighting tricks. Right?
time.
So it's like okay, they have overhead lighting, like they're gonna look harder than what they really are, you know, right now. Um, I think another thing about before going into peak week, and y'all have probably maybe already seen the webinar that was going to come out, was assessing if it is like fat or water,
Yeah,
truly, you know, and how much are you accepting in that? Because I've had people that are retaining some water and that's okay. I think that is okay. We don't need to be chasing like dropping water weeks out from a show. It's
Right.
just part of that assessment process of, hey, there's water present. We should be more asking like if that's a side effect of why, because fatigue is there. Should we always be trying to manage fatigue on prep? Yes, I absolutely think so, the fullest that we can. But we also have to accept that some fatigue has to be there when you're on low calorie, low body fat, and you're pushing for the last bit of fat loss. We're not going to be able to remove all fatigue and you look your best at all times. There's going to be stages where your client is going to accumulate a little bit of a water film. And you just have to realize that it is there if you're making those assessment calls,
Yep.
and those are when you should be going through your questions with them if you're seeing a lot of that. Like, how was sleep the day prior? Was meal timing the same? Were fluids off or anyway? Was it a more stressful day?
Yep.
And to see like, all right, let's go through our recovery check boxes and make sure you are ticking off all those marks, and then also making sure that fatigue isn't to a level where it's diminishing what we can bring onto stage. And I think that's when it's a point on prep where you need to like do some bigger fatigue management strategies. If you
Yep.
have so much fatigue and that they're driven so far mentally and physically in the ground that they're no longer to put the same effort level into their prep, and so now you're hindering fat loss, I think that's an issue. Or even if, like, we know, like from the research, like if sleep is that far diminished, in those studies where they have sleep deprivation, like they lose less fat mass and more muscle mass. It's like, well, is that a what we're looking for to bring someone to stage? Like, fuck no. Like, we want to uphold muscle mass as much as we can and fat and decrease fat mass. So it's like, well, okay, we need to like manage fatigue, training performance. That's the biggest thing that we have for like holding tissue and prep. It's not, what's taking enough Anavar or something. It's upholding your training. And so if we have fatigue so high that training's just running into the ground, it's like, okay, now it's time to do something about it.
Yep.
Water might be a side effect that's there, but we have to go back and say like, well, why is it there? And should we be managing fatigue at X weeks out?
Yep.
I think the issue is like it kind of blurs your assessment, right? Like, is this that's part of the issue. Is like, is this person is the fat off, or are they soft? And I think going through those questions I just mentioned can kind of pull some of that out. Like, okay, this is water. Well, I know they're still in deficit. They didn't have a cheat meal, and so you'll have moments of like, all right, let's push them, and then we'll drop off fatigue, and then we can get a clear picture of where they're at once we wash that off, and then
Yeah.
go from there.
And I think one important thing to tease out is like to understand that no matter what your prep process look like, fatigue is going to be there.
Yeah,
And to not, and excuse my French, but not let fatigue make a bitch of you. Like, it's important to communicate what all the variables are doing, but understand that you're gonna feel that, right? Like coming in, and it's all about the communication process and having those variables tracked, right? Because that will tell your coach or us, whoever, like what is actually going on, right? And so it's not that you don't want to communicate like that, those issues, but it's hard to differentiate sometimes with clientele, like how objective they're being on like how fatigued they are.
yeah.
And those objective tracking, that objective variable tracking is what gives us that deciphering tool of the feedback you're giving. And then just working with someone over a long period of time, you know how they communicate too, which is important. Kind of going into that peak week, which I think is kind of where we need to kind of get into next is, I know a lot of the questions are around like food and water and sodium manipulations, but a lot of the questions I get too are training based. Like,
Yeah.
how do I pull back training? Do I pull back training? When do I pull back training? And maybe just walking through the days leading into the show, like what that's going to look like for you might be smart leading into Indy, just to kind of set that framework of an example of what that looks like. And then maybe we start to touch on like the food, water, sodium part.
Yeah. So going into Indy, as far as like right outside the 7 days out, I don't really have much difference in training there. I don't. There's not a reason to make vast changes in your training. If what's been working is what you would want to stay consistent with your same training split. Things that I do auto regulate throughout the days. Sometimes are exercise choice. Sometimes Just as like body weight hits some lows, there's some movements that I feel so unstable in that I just have to move to a more stable position. So, example, it typically is like a back squat going to a hack squat. That's usually not I'm not back squatting anymore, but um, one that I ran into was an RDL. I had been doing RDLs for a while, and it was I think 2 leg sessions ago. uh, it's such a taxing movement technical wise and to keep a lot of core stability that I end up moving over to like a hack squat good morning. It's much more stable in position. I can focus. And I think it's just a safety standpoint, but I can still give an awesome stimulus. The issue to it was like, well, it's kind of novel, isn't it? It's like, man, you're doing a very similar movement pattern. I don't think it's novel enough to where you're going to generate a lot of localized fatigue. Like if I had never done a hip hinge and now I'm doing a hip hinge, a few weeks out, because that could limit the next day's level of fatigue of doing cardio or training. But those are some of the changes I've made, just moving closer to peak week as I need to. Also, there's been some volume manipulation. So I want to make sure I can uphold training performance within a set first. That is probably like a high quality set. And so I don't want a bunch of shit sets. So if I see my like performance is starting to decline, I know I can do less volume, and that won't impede recovery as much, but I'll be able to uphold my quality of set stimulus. And I think that's what's really important is some people do more sets, or they'll just do more shitty work because like, oh man, I couldn't put as much into that set, or my load dropped and I'll just do another set of it. I think just reducing the number of sets has helped. So right now, like my leg volume is down to like low baseline. Like yesterday's training, I did 3 sets of leg curl, 2 sets on leg press, 1 set on the pendulum squat, and then I did 2 sets of like glute kickback machine. So but the intent was there, like the effort level, I kept it high, which I'm not at this point. I'm not taking it like leaving my soul on the floor. Like I'll go to probably like still an RIR of 1. It's there, like I'm just not going for the reps that I know that are going to bury me. And there was a few exercises where I will drop load off because, coming down, I was 223 when I started prep. I was 206 today. Strength, you're going to have some loss. It's going to be there. Just even mechanics will change slightly. So it's okay to reduce load. I think especially from a safety standpoint, like if you need to move, like if you're seeing your reps drop down, you're like, okay, I'm going to do a set of 6 now. It's like, man, I think the risk is too high for being so close to a show.
Yeah.
Just allow the reps to come up. But anyway, my split has been push, pull. I have like this kind of delt arm calf day, then a leg day, an off day. And so yesterday was 9 days out. I hit legs. I have my off day today. That's 8 days out. And tomorrow will be 7 days out. So I'm going to run my same split. I'm not going to change much. But going into peak week, the exercise will stay the same. I'm still going to manage my number of sets I do. Likely I might just regulate the effort level slightly, especially on that last leg day, because I will be about 4 days out when I hit my last leg session. I might smooth it back because this leg session wasn't that taxing, so I might run like pull push legs to where I hit that a little sooner and keep that leg session just the higher reps like I've done and the RIR backed off so I don't generate fatigue. Then I might do a delt arm day. Then my last training session, it will be like a Thursday, 2 days out. And that will be different. And I will be more like, I like doing kind of a full body, 2 sets per muscle group, 12 to 15 reps. It's more so just to expend some glycogen and improve uptake, and nothing that's going to be causing like muscle damage and soreness. And that's typically how I'll run it. So my last week will probably be pull, push, legs, delt arms, then like this upper body day. Friday it will be off from the show. So there won't be too much vastly changed going into Indy. I think keeping it fairly consistent.
Yeah. And I think that's important to understand is like there is some minor manipulation, but for the most part, it's pretty consistent. Just to touch on like the change in exercise thing, like people don't realize that change in circumference of weight can make a large difference in your capacity to brace. And then like on the novel stimulus side, like probably the fatigue you generate from trying to brace, being 20 pounds down throughout that RDL pattern is going to be a lot more stimulating than the fact of moving to that different hip hinge that is a little bit more externally braced. One thing that I'll do to combat this within prep is like at the start in the program, introduce like a rotary pattern, which is like maybe the one that's more taxing throughout that brace pattern. And then the opposite week is like the one that's a little bit pulled back. And so I can lean into that one that they've already been doing throughout the whole prep more and just remove it. Remove the
Okay,
other one.
that's smart. So you'll have like an A/B rotation. Maybe it's only for that exercise then, not the
Yeah,
whole
so it's
day.
not the whole session, it's only for that exercise. So like let's say a client squat pattern for that leg day is like um, a safety bar squat or a Smith squat, right? And then it's like a machine-based squat pattern, whether it be like a hack squat or something along those lines. Something where maybe having that brace capacity can be limited. I can pull back on the rep range and the load capacity, and I can also eliminate the need for that stability pattern, right? And so I can just pull the one that's more taxing and move to that the last few weeks because they've already been doing it. So I'm not introducing a novel stimulus. And then the rest of the session is the same.
And one thing I do tend to like going into like peak week for a lot of clients is keeping the days pretty consistent. And so like sometimes the split will just land to where you might have an off day like 3 days out. And it's like, I don't really like to do that. What I really do is take their full split, reduce the volume per session. So for one, fatigue's going to be really low because they'll have a short training session, and just move that volume to that other day that might be an off day. So they
Yep.
can still we can keep the diet pretty consistent. They're training every day. It's like this routine is just built in place. And so I've had that where like maybe they're doing push pull legs and I could just pull all like side delt and arm work off and like throw it onto a day and they
Yep.
can go train it and do it that way. So they're not changing the split that much.
Yeah. I did that last time I competed. It was
Yeah.
a situation like my rest day fell on Wednesday before the show. And instead we just did like a little arm and delt work beforehand that Wednesday. And then Thursday was just the full body upper pump. And so I think that makes a lot of sense. We pulled all the arm volume from push and pull and then moved that into the Wednesday before the show because that I think that routine is very important.
Yeah, I think it's not it's like the session duration is what can get really fatiguing. I think on prep, and that's a lot of the management. Like I know, like we make set reductions, and of course that drops your session back. But if you have like you get on prep and you're like, oh man, I got like 3 exercises left, and I'm already gassed. It's like, does it make sense? Like that quality is still going to be there. Maybe we should just move that to another day, and you can make that another training day.
Yeah.
And that's an option. I've seen some guys that will drop the whole split back to like upper lower from like push pull legs. I don't like doing that. I think that's a big change. I understand it, like it's a huge volume reduction, but I think it's more than what you would really need. Like sometimes just taking one set off is enough, But changing a whole split to where you have like an extra off day and a big reduction volume, like I think for most that's a big overkill. It's like the opposite in off season of like going from upper lower to push pull legs. It's like fucking dropping the hammer on like a huge volume increase or a huge volume reduction when you just need to pull off little bits at a time. And maybe it's just on one certain session. It's not even throughout your whole week. So changing your whole split just might not even make sense. That's the training piece. I think cardio should be weighed in as well.
Yep.
And a lot of this I do kind of gauge with the client, like because we talked about fatigue and water. Well, during peak week is really we're trying to almost run this deload and drop off fatigue, so you don't have any of this water retention that could be cortisol and aldosterone driven. And so part of this is like cardio, right? And so I think it's asking those questions to the client. You have to weigh in their subjective answers. If they're, you know, they're, if there's someone that has a perception of what fatigue is much higher than it actually truly is. But for some people, like
Right.
the diet side might be more of the fatigue driven versus cardio side. For some people, cardio is really easy. I have a lot of females that actually like cardio, and it's not that big of an issue. Their legs aren't heavy, and so you kind of have to weigh in, like, how much should you taper down cardio versus maybe that's bringing up food. If you what situations you run into with that,
I
Luke?
think I think I run that as like the energy availability viewpoint, and then understanding their psychological proclivity, and then making the manipulation accordingly. So like you mentioned the example of the female that likes cardio, like, okay, so from an energy availability viewpoint, like we're going to be keeping a lot of the deficit from an activity standpoint. Um, so I can make a little bit more changes on the food side to start bringing them out of that fatigue state, right? And then I can just manipulate the total energy availability as needed across the week to continue that process of fatigue drop, but not pushing them into like the spilling phase, because like it is going to utilize the glucose. And a lot of times what you'll see, like the last time I had someone last year that was like that, and it was like you introduced, like I kept the cardio in, I introduced some food, and it's like new low. It's like, okay,
Yeah,
introduce a bit more food, cardio similar, new low. And it's like that entire peak week process, you just keep seeing new lows, because the thing that stresses them out or is the hardest for them to manage on the food side is like starting to get relieved. And it's like, okay, like I can use energy balance or total energy availability as a tool to be like, okay, these are two variables that work together. Which one is going to create the biggest dividend for the person I'm working with?
I think like in these lows and things of what you're trying to do on peak week, like how much to feed someone, how much do you reduce them, and it's when you need a moderate day by day. Essentially, I'm trying to bring them to a maintenance level of
Yeah.
energy intake and expenditure. Because if they're gaining weight, well, there of course you have to weigh out if water and etc. But if they're gaining a bunch of weight, you could easily be gaining body fat that week. Um, and so like a lot of times we add in food or reduce cardio. Well, it's like that's when you ask the question, like, is this water dropping? Okay, it's a tighter look. That doesn't mean necessarily that we didn't feed them enough. Like they're all of a sudden now having a spur of like fat loss. That's not happening. So you say, okay, this was a big drop in water. You look tighter and hard. You're not flat, and so we might just keep something the same. Um, and so I think those are things you need to be weighing out. Small changes to be made, and then you just kind of monitor that response. But yeah, a lot of times I do on a little bit of both, but weighing in like what their psychological aspect is. If they like to stay moving and maybe they have an active job, we'll probably have to just be working more on the food side. So there's a component of like, hey, you're losing weight because you're dropping water. There's also a component of you could be losing because of this person is very adaptive in response. Because we
Yep.
have people are you add 500 calories in and they don't even gain weight.
Yep.
They might lose weight. And you have someone else you had 5 calories in, it's like bam, like 3 pounds up, and they don't adapt at all. And these are the people that are like you might be keeping their diet relatively the same the whole prep. You put them in a deficit, and they just keep dropping. You have other people that start like even yourself. Maybe you're like 5,000 calories. You end up finally on like at the ship, like one week out, you're like 2,000, 1,500 calories. Like, what the hell? It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
man, you're just super adaptive, and it'll go both ways when you gain or cut. But you have other people that aren't the same. So peak week, it's like, whoa, man, I'm like totally speeding up. It's like, well, yeah, there's some adaptive component. You're also, we're having fatigue drop and water's dropping off. But yeah, for this week, we're gonna watch them daily, assess if is this a water drop, are they tight, are they flat, and then the next day it's like, okay, let's pull back a little bit more cardio. For me, a lot of times it's like 10 minutes of like if it's a moderate intensity cardio doing, I'll do 10 minutes, or it might be if I'm doing step count, that might be like a 2,000 step count reduction, which is about a mile, which for myself is around 110 calories. For like a small individual, that might be 70 calories, which that could be a pretty substantial amount for like a small bikini competitor, 70 calories. At that point, if they're eating 1,000, that could be enough to bring them to maintenance actually. So just small adjustments and watch them daily. or the food additions. You know, it's enough to be like a maybe initial 5 to 10% increase in calories, then monitor them, and then from there it might just be like 5% increases in food. I mainly go carbohydrate based from
Yeah.
there. Um,
Same. Right around that 3.5 to 5.5% change on the food, probably most of the time.
yeah, and like putting like data to that, like if you're on 2,000 calories, a 10% increase is a 200 calorie increase. Um, so you're looking at like 50 grams of carbohydrates. That's
Yeah.
that's a good amount. 5%, that a 25 gram increase in carbohydrates doesn't sound like a lot, but at that stage, it does go a long way. For me, for Indy, that's what I first started doing because I was ready like pretty much 3 weeks out for the show, and I started with like a 25 gram carb increase and kind of rode that for a few days, and then I would keep dropping, like, oh shit, okay, so this is after like 2 3 days of that. Well, let me add in another 25 grams, and then I keep dropping. Then I have a big drop, like whoa. Then I'll do like a 50-gram carb increase, um, and same thing, keep going. And what I do notice too is like as you add in food, you have to consider like people's psychology will change slightly as far as their ability to put effort into everything they do. Like their NEAT, their training effort, like could increase. And so overall, they might have a little bit larger increase in energy expenditure. So a lot of times it's not like they're speeding up. It's like they're speeding up their movements or their activity or their effort level. And so there's no magic here. That's what I want to say. But
Yeah.
but like for this, I hit a low, um, 10 days out, dropped down to like 205. Like holy shit! It was a delta and arm day. I had added 50 grams of carbs in that day too, and that's I woke up on my leg day at 205. I'm like, oh shit! So I added 100 grams of carbs in on leg day, and that finally brought body weight up. It was 205.8 today.
Yeah.
So I'll have days like that. I have this data as I've been eating into the show of like, on leg days I'll do this much of an increase to be close to maintenance and fuel training. Then my other days will be more constant. Um, so that's how I've been kind of adding in food, at least going into Indy. And I haven't messed much on the cardio side because I only do steps. So 12,000 steps a day is like so fucking easy. It doesn't fatigue my legs until it did. and like I had some days that like post leg day and I'm surrounding it. So I'll pull down steps some. My steps now are like 9,000. So it was like a 3,000 step decline. And that's been managing leg fatigue really well. So it's like, all right, I don't need to mess on the cardio step side anymore. I'm just manipulating food. And it's kind of nice to have less variables to manipulate also going into the show because I can be more predictive with it too.
So let's make a comment on that real quick. So a lot of these people listening or coaches running preps are not only going to be using steps or treadmill as their cardio implement. And so that cardio implement change is a way to drop fatigue moving into that peak week, right? Like
Yeah.
pulling Stairmasters or pulling bike sessions or pulling whatever implement they're using that may be slightly more fatiguing than just incline treadmill walking or just doing steps in general. And so then like you have to ask that question like, okay, what is the possible caloric difference of the activities between so that you have that consideration and the change and implement instead of just looking at the time variable. Because I know it's easy to look at the time variable, and that's a good way to look at it or the step count variable if it's the consistent cardio usage.
Yeah.
But if the implement changes, then we have to consider the fact that the output changes as well.
Yeah, definitely. Like 10 minutes on the Stairmaster is not the same as 10 minutes on the treadmill, right? Or 10 minutes walking outside.
Right.
And so I've had some clients, and it's challenging that they're like, hey, some days I have access to this equipment, some days I don't. It's like, okay, well, if you have this, you do this much time. If you have this other way that I know expends more, you need to do this much time. Usually it's a pretty big discrepancy. It's like I have the Stairmaster or I have a treadmill. It's like, okay, well, you're gonna need to do like another almost double the time on the treadmill, depending, just depending. But um, so in general for this peak week going in, just to recap with some of those things, training's relatively constant. There is some volume reductions, effort level reductions. Cardio will be tapered based on the individual's need for fatigue
Hmm.
management and the psychology aspect. And then we're going day by day with food increases based off of trying to keep them close to a maintenance level and assessing that maintenance level if it's
Yep.
water drops, glycogen fullness, and then trying to make sure they're achieved that true maintenance, and then monitoring where's the best look throughout that. So for Indy, my approach has been eating into the show. I don't, because you could do a front load or back load of carbs, like so. I think that introduces a lot of variability in, and it's a roll of the dice if you haven't been practicing it on your refeed days.
Yep.
There's benefits to all of them, and there's also cons to all of them. If you've been able to drop off fatigue, 2 weeks out from the show, and you're continually adding in food, you're going to get a pretty good idea of a maintenance level that you're at, and probably going to be at a spot where you're still hard, and when you train, you look really full and rock solid. No one's going to be like full blown full, usually without having some spillover. This has always been my preferred method is being get lean ahead of time and then eat into the show and achieve that maintenance and just walk out there. Like seriously, water's the same, food's the same. I just literally walk on stage. That's a luxury, and I feel like a lot of people don't get there because we don't set the timeline up from the beginning right, and we have to rush fat loss to the very very end. And
Yep.
usually it's your second show where people look better because they set that up now. Now they can eat into the show, and it's a much better refined look, less fatigue, and sometimes people just don't drop off enough fatigue before the show. I've seen it. I've done it too. So I think if you're going into your show and you still have fat to lose, probably I almost weigh in that it's the best, and don't try to race fat loss off for 3 more days. It'd be probably better just to drop off fatigue and go ahead and run like your normal peak week process, and lose any water that you might have. I think that will improve your look, and also you'll have that consistent diet that you nailed throughout the week to walk onto stage and not try to be like, all right, now we're the last day, we're gonna carb backload and then go back to this other low fat diet, and then they maybe drop a bunch of water weight from fatigue dropping, or they don't. I think if you can still plan this a little bit earlier, that would be the better process to do.
Yep.
Um,
And it keeps those
versus,
variables more consistent
yeah,
too. You can gauge response a lot better. Like you walk through that thought process with the 50-gram ad and the 100-gram ad according to the day that you're training, plus the response on the weight on the day to day. It's like you make such more objective decision making because you had those variables consistent and you're maintaining that look moving in, right? And then now you can make that decision on a day-to-day basis based on what happened to the response the day before.
even coaching myself, it's made it a better psychologically because I can monitor this response daily moving in. And so like, all right, it's like on my off day, I'll know how my look changes. And so it's like, well, one day out is going to be an off day. So I kind of have a gauge on what that diet should look like. And then and even the carb amounts. And so it makes it a huge stress let off when you're like, okay, it's peak week now. I don't know. We'll just see how it goes day by day. I might do this carb backload. How many carbs should I have today? I've had these discussions with other coaches, like how many carbs should I give this person today, or how much fluid should I add in or remove? It's like if you're asking this in your one day out, like this is problematic, I think, because you're guessing, and we don't want to be guessing when someone's worked so hard all the way to the end. Like they should look pretty damn close to ready, and I think the last minute manipulations of what we shouldn't really be doing. Now, there's situations where that might take place, but I feel like those are really the anomalies in areas. And then
Yeah.
I do have people ask about like high level of androgen use and
Yeah.
manipulating that because the androgens, for one, you might have some estrogen that you have to manage, but this is something that needs to be done weeks out because a lot of your compounds, the esters links that you have in place, will need to be adjusted long before you're into peak week. A
Yeah.
lot of the time, what is driving up water retention with higher androgens, because you look at like, well, what about these bigger bodybuilders? that have to have this requirement to hold this size, and a lot of it's aldosterone driven by compounds, and they all do it. There's not like a safe compound. Like if you take enough primobolan, you will retain water. There was a was it 1984 study using primobolan in advanced breast cancer patients and females using 1,200 milligrams of primobolan, and I think there was like 25 patients. Like 8 of them, one of the side effects was edema, and they were taking 1,200 milligrams of primobolan and compare it to 300 milligrams of testosterone propionate. And now that's a super crazy dosage. But what I'm saying is that that it will still drive up water retention. Even DHT, pure DHT, like you take provironone, and enough of it at super physiological dosage increases water retention.
Yep.
And this is independent of even androgen receptor response and even the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. So they all do it across the board if your dosage is high enough. So I think things to consider within that is the last weeks of show. If you're ready ahead and you're skinned out and you do have some water retention, adjusting your stack design to manage estrogen for one, but also to manage aldosterone. So we have, and I'm not going to get into specific compounds. Go to J3 University. I will dive deep into that and explain it all for you. But there are compounds that do cater more to rising aldosterone levels. An example would be nandrolone is one. We can transition away from those to other compounds. Also, I think you can taper down your androgens. And people don't do this, but you don't need much to retain tissue anymore, especially if you're ready ahead and now you're adding food in. Like food by far is going to drive training performance, I think, way higher than adding in another 300 milligrams a week of X drug. And I've seen it just because when I add food in, performance like all of a sudden blasted up. When I add in like oxandrolone, like 3 weeks out, it's like, I got a little bit of boost, but nothing like when I added food in. I was like skin exploding pumps and training's driving way up. It's like, well, if that's driving my performance and muscle retention, do you need to keep adding in drugs your last week of the show? Like, how does that make any sense? It's like, well, I need to get hard. What do you mean you need to get hard? It's like, well, they're hardeners. Why are they hardeners? Oh, because they're going to lower cortisol? Well, that's not the best way to lower cortisol. That's fatigue management. Oh, it's the best way to manage estrogen. Well, no, probably manipulating your stack design. And likely most of these guys, they're already taking drugs that aren't aromatizing anyway, right? Usually you're adding in, they have like a bunch of aromatase inhibitors in place. They've already added in trenbolone. Maybe they've already removed testosterone. So it's like, well, no, you're not offsetting estrogen to androgen ratios anymore. It's like, well, they're going to dry you up. Bullshit. They're not going to dry you up because I know at any super physiological dose, every single compound can drive water retention. So my question would be like, I think you could taper down your compounds going into the show as food is rising. And that would be the best thing you could do to manage that watery film that some of these guys have that's driven up by the whole renin-angiotensin aldosterone system.
Yeah.
And,
go ahead.
Sorry, I guess that's my ranting. Like I'm just fucking ranting. I feel like because it upsets me. Drugs upset me,
right? Because like people think that compound addition leading into the show is the solution for everything. Like it's the conversation of the hardener, like the hardening effects, right?
Yeah.
Like how often do you see people like adding in all of these compounds, like things come in 8 weeks out and then 6 weeks out and then 4 weeks out and then 3 weeks out and then 2 weeks out orals and then 1 week out it's something else, right? And it's like, yeah, we should probably look at what else these androgens are going to be influencing outside of just the AR, right? And maybe looking at if we can gauge a response, it's better with manipulations of reduction. Because like you said, like performance is probably our main tissue maintenance driver, and food is going to drive that more than any addition of a drug on an acute level as anything else at that point, right?
Yeah.
And so those manipulations coming in should be, but I think one thing that may, as a coach, just psychologically, like having that conversation with your client of explaining that logic so they understand why you're pulling drugs, especially if it's the first time a client's prepped with you, because they're so used to this like add drug, add drug, add drug, add drug, add drug philosophy, rather than pulling it into a taper into that peak week, and it's important for them to understand that. At the same time, the more buy-in that you create, the better the response is going to be, and the lower the stress, and the easier it is going to be to drop the fatigue as well.
Yeah, I mean, you would be dropping down like oxidative stress and inflammation in the body from using like these higher drug
Yep.
compounds, which I think give it a lot better look. And by that point, if you are really really lean, you shouldn't be having a lot of water outside the muscle, because people say like, oh, I don't want to lose fullness. Um, and yeah, some of these compounds do drive up like glycogen storage and creatine phosphate stores and give you like that fuller look, but you have to have a balance there and weigh that out, because the guys that I know that come in super full, that have like the extra 5 pounds of weight on, they're never super hard. Uh, they're not like some of the biggest guys out there. Um, Usually are never nailing their look, and it hurts them because they're trying to stay really full. And maybe it is they're holding drugs, or maybe they just haven't decided to want to push their body weight down more. A lot of times I think they're leaving too much in to have that full look.
Agreed.
And when you can make those manipulations, and dude, these guys are so big that it won't even matter. If you're not hard, it doesn't matter. I think I think of Rami in this. Not, I don't know what Rami does. Only a few people do. But he for sure has like sacrificed some body weight over the years, come down lower, and he's still gigantic. But he's actually he nailed his conditioning and is just like really hard, and it's such a better, impressive look. And so when we come to stage, like that needs to be in your priority, like being as hard as possible. It's okay to sacrifice that little extra fullness of what that drug's giving you, because that fullness, like more water in the muscle is going to be more water outside the muscle. You need that fluid balance or you're going to die. Like it's not just muscle, it's everything, like across like nerves, across the heart, like all this has fluid balance, so you have to have all that in place. But so this has been my thought process going into Indy, and by far this has been the lowest total milligram drug load I've ever run to a prep, and I'm by far the hardest I've ever been going in prep. And am I adding in all the hardeners? No, I have less than I've ever run before. Um, and I think that's, it's been cool to be able to do it myself, not because of like how low can you get away with. Like, yeah, I have like, I want to have a longevity in this, and if I can use less and get a great result, that's even better. I've been able to better manage all my variables, my training, my nutrition, my sleep, to where I don't have to rely on anything ever. But at the same time, I'm able to really draw out and pull out what is working and what's not. And I think what you had mentioned, Luke, is like for drug design, like you need to do it and have a rationale and be able to explain the things that you're doing and adding each compound. And these should be based around the client individual's need. Not that at X weeks out, we add X compound because that's just what you're supposed to do. Why are you supposed to do it? Ask the whys. Why are you supposed to add Provirone 3 weeks out or halo testing? Like, why? Why do I need that right now? And if you start asking the whys, you might have great explanations. If you don't, then that should be really bringing the question, do you need it for your physique to improve? And I think in the bodybuilding realm, it's easy for us to throw the kitchen sink on and threw everything in the kitchen sink, or the baby in the bath water. I don't know what the sayings, but just like with everything we do, like more cardio, train harder, train with more sets. Make sure you take every single drug, because we don't want to miss one like application or leave something out there. So, but I think if you get down to it, you could really dial back the total androgen loads that people are using. It really doesn't take much, from what I've learned, to hold tissue. And each compound, like you said, Luke, I think it's understanding mechanisms of action. All these compounds, they all do the same thing for the most part. They all work in these different mechanisms, whether it's the androgen receptor, some are working around the glucocorticoid receptor, or they have effects on aromatization or not converted DHT, etc. Like all these different things, GH, IGF-1 axis, some more than others. And I think the some more than others is where you play each compound, and you might be manipulating compounds, but big picture, they kind of do the same. But I think it's important for us to really start pulling apart, why are we using these things, and assessing the need for a client.
Yeah, and I think all of this boils down to, whether it's the drugs, the nutrition, the training, is understanding what your largest influencers are. And no matter what the decisions being made, whether it's the implementation of the drug or the pulling of a drug or the implementation of training or nutrition or cardio or whatever, having a mechanistic understanding to explain what you're trying to influence and how that variable is going to influence that. And on the drug side, that's understanding mechanistically how all of these drugs work. On the nutrition and training side, it's understanding the psychological proclivity of the client and what's going to create the largest change in whatever may be the rate limiter in that situation. And having that logical thought process of what's the largest influencer for that person tells you the decision that needs to be made, whether it be drugs, whether it be nutrition, whether it be training, whether it be cardio, and whatever. And that's where the data collection and the understanding this stuff on a deeper level now guides the decision making leading into the show.
Yep, beautifully said. I think that probably wraps up some of this peak week conversation.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's
right?
cherry top.
There's with peak week, there's just so much to it that people make it way overcomplicated, and the understanding is not there of the basics. And so to understand something that's so multivariable and complicated, no one does. And if they try to explain it like they do, they're just bullshitting, or they're ignorant of what they really do know, or naive,
Yeah.
So for me now, going into Indy, the basics have been set. I understand those basics, and I will be cruising into the show, and I'll be bringing a look that I know that I can nail any day going into this peak week, and not roll the dice and mess it up. I actually want to present what I have, and I have these picks that I'm like, man, this is a crazy look. I want to show this on stage, and I'm going to try my best to do it. There's I've had some clients that stress a lot, and even right before they walk on stage, they look great, and then they go back there and pump up. It's like they walk out, you're like, oh my gosh, what happened? It's like, oh, the stress response is crazy. But I'm pretty even keel. I'm pretty chill, so I don't think my stress response will kick in, because when I finally go out to show, it's like a vacation. So I look forward to going out to Indy and just being able to chill away from home, and enjoy the process. But anyway, guys, I hope you all tune into the show, and thank everyone always as support for Luke and I, and what we do, and trying to put out real education that's transparent for you guys. So if you'll please reach out to us on IG, and we'll look forward to talking to you all next time. It's J3U Podcast. Over and out.